At this time, Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. So the 5 cities of the plains, which were all united, are making war against these other people from their east. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, the Salt Sea. For 12 years they had been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. Now, this point in time, where we don't really have nations and kingdoms the way that we will later on. We read about Nimrod building an empire as an early version of a kingdom in the second generation after the flood, made up of cities. But we're really talking about a series of city-states that have an alliance with each other. Okay, we have the Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar. Those 5 city-states which were gathered around the Jordan Valley. Let's see, this is the whole plain of Jordan. These would have been individual cities that would have been aligned with each other. So we think of, it says kings, and that would have been an appropriate term to use. But in terms of their sphere of influence, it's more like maybe a mayor. I mean, they would have had more authority over their city than a mayor has over a city. But we're not talking about like kings of huge empires here. We're talking about heads of city-states. Like the king of Sodom would have been like the ruler of that city. More authority over that city than a mayor has over a city in today's culture, but still his influence would have been limited to that city. And they would have aligned with each other against these other cities that would have been aligned together. Later on, as time goes on, these cities will form nations, and then kingdoms, and these nations will fight and be conquered and merge together to form empires. But as of now, that hasn't happened yet. As of now, we're talking about individual city-states and the alliances they make together. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephaites in Ashtaroth Karnaim. They defeated the Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Shavah Kirathaim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran near the desert. Then they turned back and went to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who were living in Hazazon Tamar. So they conquered a bunch of people, in other words. So he's trying to make a kingdom. He's conquering these cities and these lands and trying to assimilate them into his kingdom. Then the king of Sodom, he is getting pushback from that. The king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Anak, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits. And when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, so they obviously lost the battle, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills. Ew, that'd be terrible. The 4 kings seized all the goods. So they were outnumbered, but they still won. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, and then they went away. This is not the end of Sodom and Gomorrah. This seems like it. This is near the end. Okay, Sodom and Gomorrah aren't going to last much longer after this disastrous battle. But this battle itself is not going to be the end of them and the other cities around them. It's not just Sodom and Gomorrah. There's actually 5 of them total. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. One who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre the Amorite, the brother or a relative or an ally of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. So he has alliances. He's made alliances with some of these people who live here. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So Abraham has his own standing army. This is not just some random dude. Abram, he may not be a king of a city-state or a king of an empire, but Abram is not just some another guy. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. Now, Lot had a wife, and he had daughters, and they would have undoubtedly been in the captive company, the company of captives. I'm guessing, they didn't. I'm guessing that these conquering tribes, these kings that conquered and took these captives and possessions, didn't make it back to their home base before Abram caught up to them. After Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is, the king's island. This guy had lost. This was a dude who tried to pick a fight with this Kedorlaomer dude and lost, despite outnumbering him, despite having the numbers advantage 5-4. He tried to fight this guy and lost. But Abram fought Kedorlaomer, attacked him from behind, and then he caught up with him, attacked him from behind, and won. So the king of Sodom is going to want to try to do something here, isn't he? Is he? So the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. After Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, I said this already. Excuse me. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. That's Salem. By the way, that's Jerusalem. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. So this was a guy who was a king and a priest of God Most High and a king of a city. And he is blessing Abram, and Abram is receiving the blessing. And we'll find out, as we read through scriptures, that the lesser is blessed by the greater. So the lesser in this case is Abram, who is receiving a blessing from Melchizedek. Now where Melchizedek came from and where he went, we have no idea. His genealogy is not mentioned. His background is not discussed. He simply was there. He came onto the scene as a king and a priest. He left the scene as a king and a priest. And that's all we know about him. And that is the kind of priesthood that Jesus Christ will assume someday. Not the Aaronic priesthood that will be established in Moses' day. Now Moses has no idea of that. When Moses is putting this account into writing, of course, the Aaronic priesthood already exists. And Moses has no concept or clue that someday God is going to replace that with a priesthood based on Melchizedek's priesthood. So Moses doesn't know why he's writing down this account of the Melchizedek blessing Abram, but we know that because we have the rest of the story. Moses didn't have that. Again, when you look at these especially anything in the Bible, but especially these Old Testament narratives, you ask yourself, why is this mentioned? Well, the stuff with Lot is mentioned because that explains where Moab and Ammon came from. The stuff with Sodom and Gomorrah is mentioned somewhat in connection to its relationship with Lot, and also to explain where the concept of judgment by fire and brimstone comes from. And here, and again, Moses doesn't know this, but the Melchizedek account is mentioned to establish the kind of priesthood that Jesus Christ will have someday, and not the Aaronic priesthood, which will dominate the rest of the Old Testament. This stuff is all mentioned for a reason, even if the people writing it down didn't know the reason. And sometimes the reason is specifically stated. Sometimes it's inferred based on the context and other things we know about the scriptures. But that is one of the useful questions to ask yourself when reading anything in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament and especially the Old Testament narratives. Like, why are certain details recorded? We might want other details to be recorded. There might be information that we wish was in the Old Testament that is not. But the information that is there for a reason. Asking ourselves what that reason is could be a very profitable question. The king of Sodom, by the way, he's still here. He came along and he's still here. Said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." So he wants a share in this victory. He's not asking for the goods, but he's saying, "Give me those people back." I mean, those are his people to begin with. They're the ones who are taken captive from his city. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have raised my hand to the Lord, the God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and have taken an oath that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the thong of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abram rich.'" And remember, the men of Sodom were wicked, which means the king of Sodom was wicked. We read that back in chapter 13, verse 13. The men of Sodom were wicked, and were sitting greatly against the Lord. That means the king was wicked. You're not going to have a good king in a city full of wicked people. If the king is good and the city of the people are wicked, they'll eventually just kill the king and make a king like them that is wicked. So this is not a good king. So Abram is not going to be indebted to this king because of his wickedness, and is not going to put himself into an agreement with this king that could give this king leverage over him. "I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten, and the share that belongs to the men who went with me, to Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre." Those are his allies. "Let them have their share." That is not the final end of Sodom and Gomorrah. The final end of Sodom and Gomorrah will occur in a few chapters, but it has not come yet. The cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, have been, at least some of them, it's somewhat disputed, but we're pretty certain we know where these cities were. We've discovered these cities. And in the archaeological remains of these cities, you can tell, first of all, that it was destroyed by a fire. And secondly, that before the final destruction of the city, there was an invasion. I'll come back with more details about Sodom and Gomorrah when the story comes back to them in a few chapters and we see the destruction of it. But this information can be backed up based on stuff that we have seen in those cities in that area. I'm not sure if they've discovered all 5 of the cities, but I do believe they have identified. I think that Gomorrah, at least in particular, has been somewhat positively identified. I haven't looked into it in a while, but when I did look into it, it was pretty convincing to me. And I'll come back with more information about that when I do the video that covers the actual destruction of these cities later on. But again, just kind of remember that whenever you read an account in the Bible, especially the historical parts, ask yourself why this particular piece of information is there. We might want other information to be there. There could be information that we wish was in the Old Testament that is not. But the information that is there for a reason. Sometimes that becomes self-evident within the text itself. Sometimes we get to that with New Testament inspiration, like the Melchizedekian account. We know why that's in the Bible based on what the writer of Hebrews says about it, and how that pertains to Jesus Christ's pattern of priesthood. And Moses himself would have had no clue about that, but we can. So Moses may have known about other things that he was doing, but there are things that were beyond his knowledge and awareness at that time. Again, the secret things that were revealed to Moses, but things have been revealed since then. But that is a useful question to ask yourself whenever you read anything in the Bible. I mean, that's true for anything that's in there. I mean, we look at the Bible, and it's a big it's a collection of books. It's a large document. It takes a while to get through it if you want to read it all. But considering how much information could have been put in there over the course of years and years and years of collections and writings, considering, later on when we get to the written documents, we're going to be reading very summary accounts, summary accounts of documents that clearly were written in much more detail by somebody at some point in time and stored somewhere that we've lost. And we could wish that was all still there and give us more information about the past. I do wish that, in fact. But that was not what the Spirit chose to preserve. The Spirit worked through human authors to produce these books, and the Spirit chose what material to include and what not to include. And so when we read these books, it can be helpful to keep that question in mind of why is this included? Why is this particular piece of information included and not something else that I would think would be more important, that I would like to have? Like when I read through Samuel and the Kings and the Chronicles, and I read these references to these other books, these other historical documents that used to exist, that contain more information about these kings' reigns. I would like to have that. I'd like to know what these ancient people knew about what their kings did. That's information is gone. It was there once upon a time, but it's been lost. All we have left is this, which is a very small amount of what used to be there. So I then have to ask myself, okay, why did the Spirit see fit to include what we have and let the rest of it go away? And that's a useful question to ask ourselves. When it comes to the Sodom and Gomorrah stuff, the Melchizedek stuff, anything involving Lot, or just, as we're tracing the seed line through Abram and on down, it's like all the things that Abram does and the encounters he has, even the story of him going down to Egypt. It's like, why is that there? And it's useful. I don't have time. I'm going to actually be leaving here in a minute or two, so I don't have time to go into detail about that. I'll come back to that later. Because we're going to see Abram do something like that again later, so I'll kind of cover that at that time. But, like, why is this, if we're tracing the seed promise through Abram, which we clearly are, Moses himself knew he was doing that. Why is this particular set of events of Abram's life mentioned and other things that he did not? Like in the Gospels, Jesus' ministry lasts 3.5 years, but only a small handful of events are really highlighted in it. Like, why are I would like to know everything that happened. I like to have a day-by-day account of what went on during that time. I don't have that. I only have a collection of accounts that are mostly the same thing, told different ways, and only really cover a small amount of what he actually did. It's like, why is this information included and other information not? And that's just something that we got to think to ourselves and ask ourselves. Okay.